climate crisis poses an existential threat, there is a silver lining. The climate crisis also presents real and incredible economic opportunities to create jobs.
If government was doing it by itself, you wouldn't have the breadth of expertise you need.
It is essential that the relations between China and the United States become functional.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Here's what's coming up on today's program. Evergrande's moment of truth arrives. Bond payments deadlines loom this week. Concerns about the embattled developer's fate and spilling into China's financial markets. Olaf Scholz wins the third and final TV debate. The SPD frontrunner faces a closed-door grilling from lawmakers about this month's raid at his finance ministry. Only 6 days to go until the German election. And the Arc de Triomphe is draped down in giant sheets of plastic in tribute to a late artist's unfulfilled dream. This hour, we speak to the man who oversaw it, Christo's nephew, Vladimir Yavgachev. So first thing is first, though, let's check in on the markets, and there's definitely a sea of red across the board. Now, this is for a couple of reasons. First of all, the European stocks down some 1.8%. Chinese stocks are closed today because of a holiday. The focus is on Evergrande, the fact that actually there's a liability looming on Thursday, that we could see some bonds having to be refinanced, and it's unclear what the authorities want to do it. It's also unclear if they do decide to let some steam off in the economy with Evergrande. It's unclear the repercussions that entails. The DAX down some 2.1%. It's basic resources that are under a lot of pressure, luxury stocks as well. And you can see iron ore 92.50. Now that goes back, of course, to the story we saw in China. If we look at the individual map and look at example for what's happening in the FTSE compared what's happening in the MIB FTSE over in Italy, the CAC 40, one of the biggest losers, down some 2.3%. This is because of the luxury stocks that are also under severe pressure. And then you can see the DAX down some 2%. Now, it is a big week for the markets. Let's look at the groups, but there is the Fed that will give an indication of taper or not. There's a debt ceiling in the U.S., which is putting also extra pressure. And then, of course, we have Evergrande and exactly the decision that will come from PBOC. So there's a lot of central bank and policymakers coming out. You can see basic resources, banks, insurance, all down between 3 and 3.2%. So investors focusing on the risk of contagion from China's Evergrande, shares of the property developer have already plunged to their lowest since June 2010, with bond payment deadlines on Thursday a key test for the company. So let's bring in our China credit editor, Kevin Kingsbury in Hong Kong. So Kevin, where are things coming to a head now for the property developer?
Well, it's been a slow burn really for the last several months. There's been pressures building. The bond prices have plunged from roughly 80 to 90 cents on the dollar to anywhere between 15 and 25 cents. So it's been a really big decline in the last several months as folks have been worried about where the money was going to come ultimately for Evergrande to be able to make their bond payments.
So, Kevin, I was asking you actually how much liability, Evergrande have, and you were saying it's $300 billion. What are we expecting from these bond payments deadline this week?
Well, there's a 30-day grace period. So actually, even though the bond payments or the coupon payments are due on Thursday, there's 30 days before there's actually an event of default. So that's when we'll really be able to see. They have this 30 days to kind of get their act together to see where we're going to be and what ultimately is going to happen with being able to, whether they make the payments or whether there's some sort of state aid. It kind of gives even the government a little bit of time to be able to kind of craft how exactly is the Chinese government going to be able to deal with Evergrande. What do they want to do? Is there going to be any sort of harangue type bailout for Evergrande, or is there going to be some other kind of step that they take to kind of make sure that there's not this too big to fail that they want to really get to really keep it from going that way?
Kevin, thank you so much. Kevin Kingsbury there with the very latest on Evergrande. Now joining us is Agnes Balash, Chief European Strategist at Behrings. Agnes, thank you so much for coming on a day where actually you see some of these, well, most European stocks really under pressure, with the CAC 40 down some 2.2%, basic resources down some 3%. What is the market worried about right now?
Good morning, Francine. Well, a number of things, of course. Where are we in this cycle, and where are we going to be with these emerging markets that are trembling on the horizon when they usually account for 50% of global growth. And you talked about China. China is trying to teach its company to manage its risk and not to feel that the government is going to be the lender of last resort. So there's this on the horizon. Is of course, still emerging markets engulfed in the fight against the pandemic. And we don't talk much about this, but only 13% of the population is vaccinated in India and about a third in Russia and in Brazil. So that looms on the horizon as well. But the good side of this story is, of course, that this is a reservoir of strength that can unleash later and support a recovery again. There's also inflation. Inflation is always on the front burner, even though the consensus is that inflation is transitory, as you know. Everybody keeps talking about that and watching inflation expectations also in bond yields. And of course, inflation matters because the behavior of central banks is what everybody is watching and afraid
Agnes,
of after so many years of support.
Yeah, so could we actually see a protracted correction? The summer months seems to have been, you see a correction and there was always an investor that could have come in and wanted to buy. Are there too many unknowns? So you mentioned policy and inflation. We also don't 100% know how it will play out in China with Evergrande.
Yes, so there is a slowdown and there are shocks on the horizon that have nothing to do with the cycle. But I'm convinced that there is a reservoir of strength in the economy. The advanced economies haven't recovered fully yet. Employment is still not back to where it was pre-COVID. There's still people on furlough in Europe. There's still 5-6% less people employed in the US. The supply chains are not back, and that drags down PMI because of high delivery times. Inflation, will actually fall as the cycle peaks because supply chains will be back in order. So in a way, there could be a slowdown, but I think the next stage of the slowdown is not a recession and is not falling down the ground. It's actually a pickup again and another type of expansion, a reacceleration of the economy. So I think we have to keep our eyes on the horizon and just drive through these shocks in the near term.
Agnes, if you look at some of the things that we're seeing on the market, so basic resources under significant pressure, luxury under significant pressure, what industries do you like actually in Europe?
Well, so these are still very high quality companies, and it's normal to be afraid of a shock to the biggest demand, the biggest source of demand for these luxury goods. I think, probably, the value and the quality of these companies hasn't declined because there is a shock in China. The population is not going to stop consuming. There's one sector of the economy, the property sector, that that has to learn how to deal with risk and managing its debt. But it doesn't mean that the population will just stop consuming. So I think Europe is quite strong. As you know, it surprised on second quarter. The third quarter is going to be excellent. Europe is far from having been peaked. I am not particularly worried about the direction of market values on a day-to-day basis.
Is there anything, though, Agnes, which you find actually of better value or more attractive right now? What would you buy?
Well, I don't quote single names, of course, but if my theory is correct, if my view is correct that the economy is still going to reaccelerate later down the road, next year in second half or maybe the end of the first half, then value stocks still have further to go. Growth stocks are still always good, and there are some tech growth stock in Europe that have high values. And of course, credit spreads are very good, NPLs are really low, and when the economy will finally peak, they will be more on that side as well.
Agnes, thank you so much for joining us. Agnes Balash there, Chief European Strategist this morning. Now stay with Surveillance Early Edition. Only 6 days to go before the German election. Today we discuss the rebooting of the German economy. Joining us this morning, the Chief Executive of the aerospace company Lilium, Daniel Wiegand, and Professor Jens Sudekum from HHU. But up next, we speak to the man who covered the Arc de Triomphe in giant sheets of plastic to honor his late uncle. Christo's nephew, Vladimir Yavachev, speaks to us. If you have any questions for any of our guests, IB Plus TV Go. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacquet here in London. Now, here's what we'll be looking at this week. Canada holds a snap election today. On Tuesday, the Greenwich Economic Forum will begin, and speakers will include Bridgewater co-chair Ray Dalio and former Fed chair Alan Greenspan. The OECD will also update its forecast for major global economies. On Wednesday, we get rate decisions from Japan and the US. The BOE's rate decision will be on Thursday, as well as Eurozone, UK, and US PMIs. On Friday, then Biden hosts the Quad Leaders Summit with Scott Morrison of Australia, Narendra Modi of India, and Yoshihide Suga of Japan. Now, onto something more lighthearted, but just as important. Giant sheets of plastic have been draped down the Arc de Triomphe's monument in Paris in tribute to a late artist's unfulfilled dream. Now, the memorial in the French capital has been covered in 25,000 square meters of plastic, wrapping over the next few days. The idea was first imagined by Bulgarian-born artist Christo, who died last year, and his late wife and collaborator, Jean-Claude. Well, Christo's vision was finally brought to life by his nephew, Vladimir Yavachev, at a cost of about 14 million euros. Well, Vladimir joins us now. Welcome to Bloomberg, Vladimir. I know it wasn't, without a fair share of, if not controversy. I know there were falcons nesting on the Arc de Triomphe, and these things are always colorful and always a little bit of drama ensuing it. Vladimir, we heard from the Paris mayor saying that, look, Christo overwhelms us, Pradas makes us talk. What's the number one reaction you've gotten the most from people watching?
Oh, I haven't had any time to actually listen to the reactions of people because it was the first weekend. We had a lot of organizational things that we have to take care of. And yes, the project was postponed twice. Initially, we had to postpone it because of the falcon nesting in the Arc de Triomphe. It was supposed to be in April of 2020. We postponed it to September of 2020. Then naturally, we had to postpone it because of the pandemic by a year, because our window of opportunity to complete the project is between July 15th and November 10th, because the Arc de Triomphe has to be in its full glory on the 14th of July for the National Day of France. And it has to be, we have to wrap out and move out of the Arc de Triomphe by November 11th, which is the Armistice Day, the celebration of the end of World War I.
Vladimir, talk to us a little bit about the reason behind this. So I've heard, this is about freedom. I've also heard this is about sustainability. What was the guiding thought behind covering the Arc de Triomphe?
Well, Christo moved to Paris in 1958, escaping communist Bulgaria, leaving communist Bulgaria in 1956, and going through Vienna and then Geneva, and ending up in Paris in 58. And at that time, he lived quite close to the Arc de Triomphe, and he had a lot of ideas for wrapped public buildings, being a stadium, prison, parliament, or a monument. And it was his expression of freedom that actually, anybody can do anything they wish, and to express this artistic freedom, because he was very much censored while he was in the academy in Bulgaria. Excuse me.
I mean this monument. Yeah. Please continue.
No, once he was in Paris and discovered himself as an artist, and he started signing the works with the name Christo instead of his last name Javachev, he really came to the idea of this freedom of expression.
Vladimir, I mean, the monument, right, the Arc de Triomphe is at once military, it's to the pride of France, it's artistic, it's historical. Has our relationship with the arts and culture changed because of the pandemic?
Well, the monument itself was built for the Napoleon built it for the glory of the returning army. Then after World War I, they made the grave of the unknown soldier and the eternal flame in order to stop any marching army to go through the Arc de Triomphe, hoping that this would be the end of all wars. Also, the Parisians use it to celebrate sporting events, and they use it to protest in front of that monument. So many people have different meaning. The monument has a lot of different meanings to many people. The 67 million French take it in different ways. They have their own interpretation of it. And now for 16 days, the Arc de Triomphe wrapped exists, and it is a work of art. It's not a monument. I mean, the monument stays underneath, but it's a work of art that is left to people to have their own interpretations of that work of art, which adds another level. And of course, it's a public work of art. It's free for the visitors to see. And it's self-funded. It's not that we don't use any public money. We don't use any sponsors or donors. It's all self-funded through the sale of the original works of art made by Crystal by his own hand.
Thank you so much for joining us, Vladimir Yavachev, there, Christo's nephew and project director at l'Arc de Triomphe Wrapped. Now, Bloomberg Philanthropies is providing in-kind support to l'Arc de Triomphe Wrapped, and Bloomberg Philanthropies is, of course, owned by Bloomberg LP, the parent company of Bloomberg News. Now, Scholz wins the third and final TV debate before the election. Frontrunner is facing a grilling at the Bundestag over the raid at his finance ministry. We'll bring you the latest from Berlin. And with only 6 days to go before Germans head to the polls, we discuss the rebooting of the German economy with the Lilium chief executive Daniel Wiegand and Professor Jens Sudekom from HHU. Now, if you have any questions for them, please IB plus TV Go. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Hi, Francine. After several false starts, bankers are finally getting back to their desks in the City of London at HSBC's Canary Wharf headquarters. Traders, salespeople and close support staff have been told they are expected to be at their workstations 5 days a week. Meanwhile, occupancy at Goldman Sachs' office is at around half and continuing to rise. And it was a big night for streaming services at the Emmys. Netflix won the Best Drama Series Award with The Crown, giving the company the top prize for the first time. Its series, The Queen's Gambit, took the Best Limited Series Award, with Apple TV's Plus Ted Lasso, won Best Comedy. Global News 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Ritika, thank you so much. Now to talk about the markets, all things market. I like the way we say that. All things markets is Live's Eddie van der Walt. You're a guru when it comes to all the quirky things that you're looking at, Eddie, so I know we want to talk about gold. But overall, why is there so much anxiousness in the markets? Is it Fed? Is it Evergrande? Is it the debt ceiling? Is it valuation? Is it energy prices?
Look, there's just a little bit of everything here. But I think, you know, we've had a significant drawdown in the S&P 500 futures. I think we're down about 3.8% from the high. But we've seen drawdowns like this before. I think what makes this time a little bit different is the fact that we've got these new narratives we're seeing this sort of second order effects of Delta. We are now seeing that implications for the property market. We're seeing the implications for the energy market. We're seeing it for a lot of other things. And all of those have the potential to just spill over into other sectors of the economy. So, you know, while markets are not in panic mode yet, I think there are reasons to be concerned here. And I think, you know, people are a little bit nervous that the Fed will pull the trigger on tapering very soon. And I think there's just a little bit of pressure, therefore, on the Fed to hold back a little bit when they meet this week.
What's going on with Evergrande? So Evergrande has 300 billion liabilities. And I know we're making parallels, but not with a lot of conviction, about Lehman Brothers.
Yeah.
Like, what happens if the authorities let it go?
Yeah, it's a very different scenario, right? I think if the authorities do have the audacity to let it go, I think, you know, we don't know what the full implications of that will be. You know, there will be secondary implications of this. People that would have used this debt to, you know, to secure further lending and so on, and there will be second order effects of that. So it's very hard to see where you draw the line under it. And I think for that very reason, the authorities will be very nervous about pulling back on this at a stage when the world economy is so fragile, right? China has a very different environmental or regulatory situation than the US is, but I do think that their regulators will be looking at this and saying, listen, we don't want that Lehman moment.
Eddie, thank you so much. At gold, are you looking at gold?
Yeah, you know what? Gold is steady despite the dollar being down. Despite the dollar being up, and I think that that to me shows there's haven buying, but it's not a panic yet. When we get a real panic, we see gold falling as well.
Gold is gold. Eddie, thank you so much. Eddie van der Veld there from our Markets Live team. Now, Olaf Scholz wins the third and final TV debate, but the front runner to succeed Angela Merkel is facing a closed-door grilling about this month's raid at his finance ministry. Up next, we bring you the very latest from Europe's biggest economy in our weekly election special. Of course, it's Germany Decides. I can't believe it. We're 6 days away from that vote. It's on Sunday. We'll also have special coverage, of course, on Sunday, starting at 5 p.m. London time. This is Bloomberg. Olaf Scholz faces a closed-door grilling at the Bundestag. The SPD candidate is answering questions about this month's raid at the finance ministry. The three main chancellor candidates clash in the third and final TV debate. Scholz brushes off last-gasp attack from the CDU. And rebooting the German economy. This hour, we'll discuss what the future holds for German jobs and industry with Lilium Chief Executive Daniel Wiegand and Professor Jens Sudekum from HHU. If you have any questions for them, IB plus TVGo, or you can tweet me at Flatwell. Now, good morning and welcome everyone to Germany Decides, Bloomberg's weekly look ahead at the Bundestag elections, which are only 6 days away. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, first thing is first, let's get more on this week's German election. Later today, Olaf Scholz faces a closed-door grilling from lawmakers about this month's raid at his finance ministry. Well, for more, we're joined by Maria Tadeo in Berlin. So, Maria, will this grilling actually impact Scholz's chance of gaining the chancellorship?
Well, you know, Francine, yesterday there was that debate. It was the third and final from the three chancellor candidates. He won that debate and he still continues to carry this momentum. So this grilling today, this is, and we should be very clear about this, there are no allegations that he personally benefited or he personally enriched from any of those scandals that we've talked about on the show prior. This is more about financial oversight at his ministry, whether or not they did due diligence and whether these outcomes could have been prevented with more diligence. So this is not personally about Olaf Scholz as a candidate, but it's more about the finance ministry. And that is the problem with this grilling. For many Germans, it is hard to pin this down to Olaf Scholz. And when you ask them, what impression do you have from him as a candidate, it's not corruption that they would argue. They'll say it's competent and competency. And this is one of the reasons perhaps as to why this is not really removing any of the shine away from this campaign. You know, it's also happening behind closed doors. So again, it does show that to make this a public condemnation will be difficult for the opposition to cling onto this card. Again, when you look at polls, he's not lost any of the momentum that he did going into this election in the final week of campaigning. And for the SPD, it really is about not making mistakes in what's left of the campaign in this week.
Maria, give us a sense of what the polls are. How many more polls are we getting, before Sunday? And actually, with the margin of error, could we really see any type of coalition?
Yes, and you know, Francine, you make a very good point. Again, on the margin of error, this is something that pollsters in Germany will tell you time after time. When you have three parties that are polling and they're so close together, the margin of error can really change things in the real election. Now, in terms of the past few days, we have seen the CDU regain some traction. We have seen Armin Laschet also winning some points, perhaps because we've seen him on the attack and on the defense, and he's been much more effective on that line. Having said that, Francine, yesterday in that debate, Annalena Baerbock did come up with a line that to me was a highlight of that debate, in which she said, for me, it would be right for the CDU to go into the opposition. She's now clearly presenting herself as the junior partner for the SPD. This is a natural coalition for the two of them. And we also know that Olaf Scholz does favor the Greens over the left when it comes to forming a coalition. So we are getting now some clarity as to what can happen the Monday after the election.
Maria, thank you so much. I'm Maria Tadeo there in Berlin for us. Now, Germany's car industry is a pillar of the economy, and it's undergoing a major shift as pressure to electrify gathers pace. Bloomberg's Matt Miller takes a look at what it means for the industry.
Germany's automakers have been a symbol of the country's economic miracle in the 20th century. But as we move deeper into the 21st century, they've been dogged by international competitors, forced to cut headcount and spend billions to electrify their fleet. German manufacturers like BMW and Volkswagen have almost been dragged kicking and screaming into the electric era after a huge diesel scandal and under very strict EU regulations. Plus, they've been motivated by the giant market cap of Tesla. Germany's political parties also continue to pay lip service to the green revolution with bonuses for electric car buyers as well as targets that they've set. For example, the Greens and the SPD now aim for 15 million EV sales by 2030.
Now electromobility is really keeping up the pace, and we are right in the middle of it.
We need time to get electric, because we need the capacities, the plants for the battery cells, and that will take time.
We are accelerating our path towards full electrification, and in fact, we're really going to go for it and see if we can convert our whole portfolio to fully electric by the end of this decade.
Now, electrification doesn't necessarily help with the job cuts. It takes fewer people to build electric motors. One survey says a quarter of the industry's jobs will be obsolete within the next 10 years. But of course, the green revolution doesn't stop with electrification. In fact, brands like Audi and Volkswagen believe that the shift to automated driving could be even more transformative than EVs, and they're going to have to add headcount to make that a reality. Now, buzzwords like green and digital are on the lips of many politicians as they head into elections this month. But here at the Munich Auto Show, the term climate neutral has become ubiquitous as this iconic industry shifts into the next century.
Bloomberg's Matt Miller there with a look at the challenges for the German auto industry. Now, the struggles the German auto industry has faced as keeping up with Tesla are a sign of the issues that companies has with embracing technology. Although the German workforce has an above-average share of tech workers, it's also still less than 5% of the workforce. And business leaders have warned infrastructure issues like slow broadband risks hampering innovation. Well, we're now joined by Daniel Wiegand. He's co-founder and chief executive of Lilium. It's a Munich-based air taxi startup that went public via SPAC merger. It valued the company at around $3.3 billion. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. I want to talk about Lilium, but first of all, I want to ask you what you need from the next German government.
Hello, and thanks for having me. So Lilium is a company developing an all-electric battery-powered jet aircraft with 7 seats that can take off and land vertically. And we're using these airplanes to connect city centers to other city centers, creating an entirely new, sustainable, high-speed transportation system that saves hours to our customers and becomes the backbone of some future transportation. So what do we need from the government for this? I think there's different things that can help us. First of all, there can be an expedited regulatory system to approve landing sites for this new transportation system and these airplanes. There could be an exemption for electric airplanes from the fossil fuel tax that we currently have in aviation. And last but not least, the government could step up with funding or act as a customer in this new sector.
Daniel, if you look at innovation, one of the biggest buzzwords actually in German history, labor wages are quite expensive. Doing business is quite costly. Is there any red tape that you need from the next government to be cut down significantly? Or because you have Tesla also betting quite big on Germany, is this really a testament to the strength of Germany in Europe?
So I think we have seen a great movement on the regulatory side of the aviation authorities in Europe. They've been very fast in creating regulation that enables this kind of electric airplanes to be certified for passenger service. Where we can still see improvements, I think, is any kind of simplification to found new tech businesses. And that really ranges from funding down to the tax system and other parts of regulation, where simplification always helps new young companies.
Daniel, having Tesla actually betting big on Germany, I don't know whether it puts extra pressure on some of the car makers and whether this is good or bad for Lilium.
I think any new tech company that grows in Europe, be this one that comes from outside like Tesla, or be this one like Lilium, is going to be tremendously helpful for Europe, because I think we have big challenges ahead in the next 10, 20 years, from climate change to big geographical and geopolitical challenges. And that means all these will be ultimately solved with deep tech and in an economic and technological race. And I think here, Europe and Germany are on a good track in growing our tech sector, but it's still not in a size where it needs to be. So tech is going to create new jobs, but it's also going to solve these problems of the future.
So what do you need, for example? Lilium has a pretty big valuation right now. What do you need to be able to compete with some of the US big startups that seem to be scaling quicker than in Europe, that maybe don't sell as quickly to private equity funds? Like, what's the difference between doing business in Europe and doing it in Silicon Valley?
Well, I think we are now in a good position because we just recently listed our business at NASDAQ and we are well funded now. But next to funding, there's other things like a harmonization of the European market in different areas will be tremendously helpful. We'll need an as free and fluent as possible movement of workforce within Europe, because there's exceptionally strong universities, there's very well-trained workforce in Europe, but we need to make sure that people can freely move where they are most needed.
So, Daniel, if there's one thing that actually, if you were in charge or if you were, the head of the finance ministry, that you would change for the next government, what would it be?
Well, I'm not sure I'm in the right position to answer this kind of question. I'm not a finance expert and not a politician. But I think I would go with trying to simplify things is the best thing you can do.
Yeah, well, I think, Daniel, actually, you'd get a lot of people's votes because people, at the moment, maybe seem disenfranchised with politicians. Daniel Wiegand, the co-founder there and chief executive of Lilium, joining us this morning. Now, don't forget, you can also catch up on our special preview of what's at stake for business in Germany's election. Germany Decides, the chief executive briefing, available to watch on Bloomberg.com or on YouTube. Now, coming up, what the election could mean for Germany's fiscal policy, we'll speak to Jens Sudokum, professor at the University of Düsseldorf. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg this is Germany Decides. This is Bloomberg, and I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, it's the first day of trading for the expanded DAX index in Germany, and it's got off to a negative start. Let's get more insight with Ritika Gupta. So, Ritika, what's changing for Germany's blue chip index?
Yeah, Francine, this is quite a makeover here for the DAX. They're increasing the number of stocks from 30, to 40, and they're adding a lot of those growthier names. So the likes of Zalando, the online retailer, and HelloFresh, the meal kit provider, they did quite well during the pandemic, and they'll be also adding those heavier names like Airbus, Puma, Siemens as well. So you're likely to see a bit more of a shift here. So some of those dividend-paying stocks like BASF, some of those having reduced prominence, and seeing the DAX shift more to some of those growthier names.
So, Ritika, will it help the DAX compete on the international stage?
Yeah, well, that's a thought here, Francine, is that it will help them play up more to the international scene here. If we have a chart here that spans over 20 years, I don't know if we can bring that up, but it shows really that if you strip the DAX of its dividends, yes, it is outperforming the Stock 600, but not by a very big gap here, and it is really lagging the S&P 500. So the idea is that maybe it could help it play catch up by adding these newer and fresher names, and also, when we've seen it with a year in the pandemic, of course, Lufthansa having to drop out because of the coronavirus, and of course being mired by that Wirecard scandal and that bankruptcy, which of course started a lot of these changes in the first place. Francine.
Ritika, thanks so much. Ritika Gupta there with the very latest on the DAX. Well, Angela Merkel was a stable presence overseeing the German economy despite being in charge during two major recessions, the global financial crisis and then the pandemic. This economic shock from coronavirus upended years of German fiscal policy ending Merkel's balanced budget regime to unleash hundreds of billions of euros in aid. Now, debate rages among the parties over the emphasis on public spending and investment once the crisis is over versus returning to balanced budgets. So let's talk more on the economic aspects of this election. We're now joined by Jens Sudekum, professor of international economics at the University of Düsseldorf. So, Professor, thank you for joining us. When you look at the economy, high labor costs, the transformation that actually the German economy also needs to get into, what are some of the policies needed that need to be a priority for the next government?
Yeah, I think the transformation of the manufacturing sector and the economy at large, I mean, that's going to be the biggest challenge for whoever will be the next German government. So we have the climate goals for Europe, which mean 55% of emission reductions by 2030. And Germany will basically have to achieve the same number. And that will be enormously costly fiscally. So the headline number for reaching the climate goals is something around 500 billion euro of additional public investment that is needed. But it's not only money, it's also modernizing all the procedures, because many of these investments, planning these investments, take awfully long, and that has to be speeded up dramatically.
Okay, so what does it, Jens, what will be the most difficult thing actually for the next government to achieve? I know at the moment, I don't know whether you think everything's open or whether you're ready to make a bet on what coalition that could be formed.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure, but I mean, if you look at the latest polls, it's becoming, I mean, the Social Democrats, they are now ahead by a margin of something like 5 percentage points over the Conservatives. And if you read the statements of the Green Party, of the Liberal Party, I think that what we call is the so-called traffic light coalition, which means the Social Democrats together with the Greens and the Liberals, that's probably the best bet at the moment. And I mean, if they actually form the government, you know, we need to square the differences in the platforms, because there's, especially on economic policy, there are quite some differences between, for example, the Social Democrats and the Liberals that need to be overcome.
Professor, I mean, she was one of the most influential leaders in the world, Angela Merkel, helping to determine the course of European and global politics. What will be hardest actually for the next government to replicate?
I think if you look at the three figures that are competing for her legacy, I mean, Olaf Scholz has been vice chancellor in the last government, and his campaign is basically built on this idea that he's like the legitimate successor of Merkel and will continue with her style also on the international scene. And probably that could work. The biggest challenge that I see, talking again of this transformation, is we need to come to grips with how to finance and how to organize these big changes that are ahead in the German economy, both in terms of transformation with the climate, also with digitalization. That will cost a lot of money, and that is at odds with the current stance that we have in fiscal policy. I mean, some parties still believe that we need to move back quickly to this balanced budget approach or the German debt brake that we have in the constitution. And I think that's naive. That will not work. I mean, with all the challenges ahead, a government needs to be ready to spend a lot more on public investment, on private investment, support for private investment. And I think this needs to be clear for whoever will be the next German government.
And so do you think, Jens Sudekum, that actually austerity will be a thing of the past?
Factually, I believe yes. Because if you drive Germany and if you drive Europe back to austerity, I mean, that will cause a big recession. In the extreme, it could mean the end of the Eurozone. So I think it's just simply not possible to move back factually to austerity. So I think one challenge for the next German government is to pursue policies that are de facto not austerity, but that are still, you know, in coherence with the laws, with the fiscal rules, because they are in the constitution, right? So you have to obey them, and you have to work basically, you have to find ways how to work around them without actually imposing austerity.
Jens Sudekum, thank you so much for joining us. He's a professor of international economics at the University of Düsseldorf. Now, coming up, Armin Laschet on the defensive as his rivals seek a united front. We get the latest on last night's German election debate. That story is up next, and this is Bloomberg.
I don't want to make any secret of the fact that I would of course prefer to form a government together with the Greens.
I think it's time for the Union to go into opposition. We have a lot of common ground with the SPD in many areas of social policy, but as I said, we need strong Greens above all to make a real fresh start.
And the real directional decision that is at stake now is, will there be a red-red-green alliance? Many positions that we have heard today are also congruent with the left party, or will there be a civic-led government?
Those were the three main candidates at the third and final debate before the election on September 26. Now let's get more on the debate with Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo. So Maria, the last and final debate, 6 days until the election. Was it actually enough to swing voters in the final week of campaigning?
Well, Francine, if you look at the poll that was done right after that debate, it would suggest it wasn't enough to swing the public opinion in Germany. Olaf Scholz won that debate. He's won every single one until now. And Armin Laschet, it is true that he has regained some ground, but that those gains are still very minimal. The CDU, if polls are correct, are heading for a terrible, terrible result on Sunday. The one thing that I would highlight, and we played it in that clip before you went to me, it's this almost suggestion from the Greens that they've made up their mind and they've decided that they want to go into a coalition with the SPD, and that is their preferred and natural ally. Annalena Baerbock yesterday was very clear that it would be right at this stage, if the polls are correct and the SPD comes first, for the CDU to go into the opposition. And that is a real shock, Francine, because we're looking at a government that would not feature the CDU for the first time since 16 years, and not a good succession plan to Angela Merkel, who would now go into the opposition.
So, Maria, is there such thing as the undecided voter in Germany right now? And I don't know whether 6 days gives enough time for any candidate to try and swing them.
Well, you know, there are, when you look at polls, there is still a mass of Germans who say there is a lot of changes. Angela Merkel, and this is something that really we need to very much factor. Angela Merkel has been in the running for 16 years. This is really part of the political establishment. And I have to say that anecdotally, when I speak to Germans, who are you going to vote for? Have you made up your mind? I am always surprised by the number of Germans who say, I don't like any of the three candidates. I'm unsure, but we'll have to wait and see. So there is a mass of voters that are undecided. However, when you look at the polls, Francine, the SPD still has that lead, and that lead has not given up.
Maria, thanks so much. I'm Maria Tadeo there in Berlin for us. Now, stay with Bloomberg. On Sunday, we bring you the live results and reaction after polls close in Germany's election. Lots more coverage still ahead. This is Bloomberg.
You have inflation suddenly appearing for the first time in, really over a decade, and it seems undeniable, and it seems as if it's becoming more widespread. So it's a lull before the storm.
We're still expecting that we'll have some clarity and probably a start to the taper before the end of the year. But keep in mind, there's other things in flux too, such as the fiscal policy.
You're going to see a lot of stupid posturing and games of chicken in Washington, but I have every confidence that this will be worked out.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Francine Lacqua, Matt Miller, and Keely Lyons.
Well, it's 10 a.m. here in London, 11 a.m. in Berlin, 5 a.m. in New York, and 5 p.m. in Hong Kong on this Monday, September 20th. Our top stories today. Nancy Pelosi in the spotlight. The fate of President Biden's $4 trillion economic agenda is largely in the hands of the House Speaker. Evergrande's moment of truth will find out this week if the troubled Chinese property giant will continue meeting obligations to bondholders. And power shortage. The British energy industry is desperately seeking a massive bailout from the government. Keep on mispronouncing it, Danny. I'm Francine Lacqua with Danny Berger here in London. Sometimes I call it Evergrande, sometimes Evergrande. Matt Miller in Berlin. Keely Lyons is actually off today. Danny, there's a huge sell-off in the markets. They're worried about the Fed. They're worried about Evergrande. And then they're also worried about the debt ceiling.
Exactly. Francine, to be fair, I think if you were in Italy, Evergrande totally makes sense. But yeah, it is such a concern in the markets today. And it's been surprising because commentator after commentator, Nordea, for example, saying, look, this isn't a Lehman moment for the markets. It will be contained. But the markets, for the most part today, it has not been contained. Now, this markets go a little bit deceiving because dollar because China is off on a holiday. So this is actually reflecting the price action of Friday. What actually traded is Hong Kong, for example, those shares dropping dramatically, the Evergrande share price dropping dramatically as well. India down too. So there you go. There's the price action for Evergrande, closing down some 10%, closing near the lowest market cap on record. So Hang Seng feeling the pain. That's what's taken the beating with China off on holiday. Again, how much of this is going to seep through the rest of markets? Now, if you're concerned about Asia, it's not just Evergrande, it's the price of iron ore as well. China wants green skies for the Olympics. They want to curb steel output because of that. So we've seen that drop 9 consecutive days in a row, also impacting the Aussie dollar there. We've seen a record short positioning when it comes to hedge funds positioning on the Aussie dollar. Now let's get a quick check and whip through your U.S. markets as well. Those, again, contagion risk from China, from the Evergrande story front and center. Yes, there's a Fed decision today, or rather this week, but today you don't care about that. You care about what's happening on the other side of the world. So S&P 500 futures, they're down more than 1%. Getting the bid is the Bloomberg dollar spot BBDXY. That's up 0.25%. So in general, those havens doing better as we not only worry about China, we worry about the debt ceiling. At the same time, you have a yield which is lower by about 2 basis points. So again, same sort of attitude there. And crude, Matt, we have WTI down 1.7%. So it's not just equities, it's commodities that are having a pretty ugly start to the week.
Yeah, absolutely. I think really Evergrande is behind all of the turmoil that we're seeing in the markets. The debt ceiling is interesting, but as Larry Summers said, this is kind of a game of chicken that we've all seen play out so many times. Certainly markets have seen it so often. Take a look at what Evergrande is doing to European markets. Bright red across the continent and in the UK as well. So we're seeing losses of 2% or more on most equity indexes. FTSE down only 1.5% in London right now. But big losses. If you take a look at the Stock 600, the broader European benchmark index, it's down 1.8% right now. You can see that investors are piling into the German Bund, pushing the price up and the yield down right now at negative 31 basis points. As Danny pointed out, investors are going into the dollar. So you see a drop in the euro, a drop in the pound, as really safe haven assets are bid on concern that this contagion from an Evergrande default is going to spread around markets around the world, Francine.
I really like what you did there, Matt Miller. Very clever. I mean, it's a, Evergrande concern.
Well, how do the Chinese pronounce it? Let's remember, this isn't an American or an Italian company, right? It's Chinese. So we don't know exactly how it's pronounced in their native tongue or what it means.
No, you are 100% right. What we do know, though, is that it has 300 billion liabilities. So if authorities are going to shore it up, it's going to be costly. It's not going to be cheap, as the British would say. A look at what else is going on this week. Head of states are scheduled to attend a week-long United Nations gathering in New York City, expanding access to COVID-19 vaccines and confronting the rising dangers of climate change will dominate the agenda. On Wednesday, it's the Fed's rate decision. It's unlikely to announce a start date to scale back asset purchases this week, but is still on track to begin this year. Now, the Bank of England also holds its monetary policy meeting on Thursday. The central bank's 8-member committee is split as to whether the criteria has been met for tightening. Also on Thursday, Evergrande due to pay interest on notes. So this is a key test of whether the developer will actually continue meeting obligations to bondholders. And finally, Germany holding its election on Sunday. Polls actually show the Social Democrat Party is set to win. It's likely to need at least one coalition partner to achieve a majority. Now, House Democrats may hold off on sending $550 billion of infrastructure bill to President Biden for his signature. It's part of a plan to keep the party united and the president's economic agenda on track. Now, House Budget Committee Chair John Yarmuth spoke about the possible delay on Fox News Sunday yesterday.
The Speaker does not have to actually advance the bill to if we pass it in the House, does not actually have to send it to the President for signature. She can hold on to that bill for a while. So there's some flexibility in terms of how we mesh the two mandates.
Anne-Marie Hordern, Bloomberg Washington correspondent, joins us from our D.C. bureau. And Anne-Marie, good morning. There's the debt ceiling left, right, and center.
needs to work through this week. We're going to get legislation on the debt ceiling this week. But what John Yermith there was talking about, the representative, is the wiggle room that Speaker Pelosi has in terms of bringing the vote of bipartisan infrastructure, which she promised to House moderates by September 27th. Now, that's just next Monday. The problem is the progressives on her party say they will vote this down unless they get the reconciliation package, which means that there's a very, very fast timetable for the House and the Senate on the Democrat side to decide the size, scope, scale of this reconciliation package. It was always going to be a very delicate dance, but you could see as we inch towards that 27th deadline, it is very much so a high-stakes game for the leadership.
I wonder about the AU, UK, US subspat. To me, it's been exciting for days. I couldn't believe that Macron recalled his emissaries, recalled his ambassadors from the U.S. and Australia. It seems like a huge spat. How's this going to work out?
You're not the only one, Matt, that was shocked. Washington was quite surprised that this was the level that Macron went to in order to, in this escalation of this spat after that nuclear submarine deal with Australia and the United Kingdom. I think many are questioning, does the punishment match the grievance, in the sense that there have been spats between Paris and Washington in the past, but this is an escalation that we have never, ever seen before. It's the first time ever that Paris has recalled the ambassador. How this is going to be potentially smoothed out, we do know that President Biden will be having a phone call this week with President Macron, and potentially that can help soften the waters. But we already see that this is definitely having a huge impact on the relationship, in the sense that also Political in Europe is talking about the fact that France wants to now rescind on some of the trade agreements they're working on with Australia. So a lot of this in Washington is viewed as definitely they don't want to escalate it, but they also view it as very a domestic play for Macron. Right. You know, France has an election in 7 months, and Marine Le Pen in some polls is starting to rise. So potentially this is his way of talking tough to French constituents.
Right. Tension's not going anywhere. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Horton in Washington. Thank you for staying on top of this for us. Now to China, where it's a moment of truth for struggling Chinese property giant Evergrande. Interest payments on 2 notes come due Thursday. It's going to be a key test for whether the developer will meet obligations to bondholders, even as it falls behind on payments to banks and other investors. Kevin Kingsbury, Bloomberg China credit editor, joins us now from Hong Kong. Kevin, one of the big questions that seems to be lingering is whether or not regulators step in. Is this going to be a Lehman moment or more of a Bear Stearns moment?
We're going to have to wait and see. We still don't have much clarity as to how exactly the government is going to act on Evergrande. China Huarong, the bad debt manager, a few weeks ago, the government was part of a bailout package for that company. Now, they don't want too big to fail to become moral hazard. They don't want the moral hazard. They want to make sure that these privately held companies kind of stand on their own 2 feet. They rise or fail on their own. And the government does not want to get involved until they really need to make sure that there is no systemic risk, that it doesn't make major contagion. So that's where we are right now.
What are we watching? I mean, the UN is one thing we're watching. I know Chinese onshore markets are closed today, right? So is all the action happening in Hong Kong and then reverberating around the world?
Right. It's very much an offshore play at the moment. China markets are closed both tomorrow and today. They will reopen on Wednesday. At the same time, Hong Kong's market will be closed Wednesday for a holiday itself. So we have this kind of holiday mix where that's probably also helping to make some of the volatility that we're seeing today in the markets globally, because we have a little bit less of market players involved at the moment.
For the very latest, thank you so much, Kevin Kingsbury there on Evergrande. Now, UK energy companies are also seeking a massive government bailout. This is as a surge in gas and electricity prices threaten to push suppliers out of business. Well, Eddie van der Veld of Bloomberg Markets joins us now. Eddie, I mean, this is a huge political hot potato, but do we believe Prime Minister Johnson, where he says actually prices will stop going down? Is this just temporary?
Yeah, I think I think it's a difficult one for the UK government because they don't want an energy supplier going under, but they don't want to take on the risk as well. And the energy suppliers, the big ones, say, listen, we don't want to take on these extra customers at a time when energy prices are so high. So it's a really difficult one for them. But for the wider market as well, these spillover effects into the wider economy, the effects on inflation across Europe. I don't think we have seen this play out yet, and it is really a very interesting moment just to see how important energy markets are for the global economy.
So if that's the global market macro risk, what about some more of the energy-focused type assets? Do you expect price action to continue to pick up in things like natural gas?
So I think there is a real risk here that what we've seen over the last couple of days is that we've seen speculative bids come in on this as well and pushed prices significantly higher. I think there is a risk here, Danny, that particularly if we see wind speeds pick up, if we see colder weather, I think in those cases there is a risk that we see prices pull back significantly over the next few sessions.
Eddie Vanderwall of Bloomberg Live, thank you so much. A lot of risks to digest there that you will stay on top of for us. Now, I want to give you a look at some of the stocks moving in pre-market trading. We have to keep an eye on China. This ETF is really fascinating to me because the direction on daily China 3X ETF, that's 3X because your exposure to the Chinese index is 3 times leverage. So it's no surprise that we're seeing a down day in Hong Kong markets, that this sort of ETF is going to be down more than 7%. It's also just frankly a way to trade China when the market itself is closed. So we could see mass exodus from this ETF as we are concerned about the risks of Evergrande spilling out, as we were just talking to Kevin about. Now, it's a down day for most markets, and cryptocurrencies are not exempt from this. Any sort of crypto-related stock seems to be dropping in pre-market session. Marathon Digital is one of them, down 5.7%, trading at $33.80. Cryptocurrency really under pressure with Bitcoin breaching below $45,000. It's a key line of resistance. Of course, when it comes to Bitcoin, it's all about those sort of psychological levels that seem to drive sentiment. Now, finally, Tesla also pointing down today, down 2% pre-market. It's following a Wall Street Journal story that's saying that the U.S.'s top investigator has been urging Tesla to address some of the safety concerns before they expand some of the self-driving features. Now, Elon Musk has said that they would upgrade some of those features as well, but so far, the cost that might imply is certainly bringing down Tesla shares. Francine, it does seem that when it comes to Tesla, a lot of times these regulatory concerns are what sort of drive the price action. But you have to imagine once we get the cash equity trading, stories like Tesla might kind of get lost in the mix, considering how macro adverse today's session seems.
Yeah, I mean, Tesla also has a huge play actually in the German economy and the German election. So we'll have a lot to chat about with our Matt Miller, who also did a fantastic roundup of some of the car makers in Germany and what that means for the German election. Now, coming up, Koku Agbo, you're welcome, Matt. Koku Agbo Bloua, Société Générale Global Head of Economics, Cross Asset and Quant Research. He joins us. We'll talk about the Fed, we'll talk about policy, and of course, we'll talk about dollar dynamics. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller in Berlin with Francine Lacroix and Danny Berger in London. Kaylee Lyons is off today. Now, I have been taking a look at the shift that we're going to see. Some people call it the fiscal cliff in terms of spending from the U.S. government. It's not really monetary policy that may matter as much when you look at the huge fiscal cliff coming. This chart, for those of you listening on radio, I'll walk you through it, and welcome, by the way, to the program, shows the fiscal policy impact on GDP. Obviously, it's been huge as we spent trillions and trillions of dollars, but when we stop doing that, you could see a huge drop, and that's precisely the worry. Joining us now is Koku Agbo-Bloua, Global Head of Economics, Cross-Asset, and Quant Research at Société Générale. Koku, welcome to the program. Great to see you again. What do you think about this fiscal cliff? I mean, we have spent record amounts of money at the United States government, and that looks like it's set to stop possibly after the infrastructure bill, or maybe before we even get there.
Yes, so this is clearly a theme we've been talking with clients for a while. To put things into numbers, $12 trillion. So this is the combined monetary and fiscal injection that took place in 2020, 2021. Clearly, the fiscal cliff, or we call it the fiscal impulse, is going to be lower in 2022 and forward. If you just need to think about the budget deficit in the US, that's going to go from 3 trillion to something around like 1.5 trillion. But it is important to bear in mind, though, that the reason why we had all that money injected in the first place was because of COVID and the restriction and the confinement, i.e. there was a collapse in demand. So the economy has recovered since, and unemployment is coming down and people are going back to work. So it is logical that given the output gap not being as significant, that the fiscal injection also needs to be lower. So I don't see necessarily as being a sort of a risk to panic, but it is clearly less supportive for markets. But the economy has been also able to stand on its own feet. So I think it is a worry, but it is not necessarily going to unravel the rebound in risk assets we've seen so far.
So, Coco, overall, what is the market worried about today? It's still a 2 to 3% decline. Do they worry more about other things? Is it the debt ceiling? Is it inflation back at the forefront? Or really, actually, we don't know how to read China at this point?
Yes, I think the market is clearly worried. I think the Delta variant is still a big tail risk. We've increased our downside probability from 15 to 20% around the Delta variant, and the risk of the Lambda or the Gamma variant. But if you think about inflation, it's the transitory camp seems to be winning the argument, even though supply chain disruption is making part of the market stubborn in terms of high prices. And natural gas prices are the recent addition to this whole picture of semiconductor chips and the impact it had on the auto industry. So I think sustained inflation is the elephant in the room. And then the last very important one is the combination of fiscal and monetary tapering that could also add to that complexity.
Coco, if that's the fundamental picture, I want you to just get that out the window. Just throw it away and put on your quant hat. I have to wonder, given some of the market volatility we've seen in S&P 500 that's unable to break its 50-day moving average, do we see some of these quant funds that balance based on volatility in the market start to force sell into the downturn we've had?
Yes, this is a good point. I think one measure to look at is the equity bond correlation. So a lot of these CTA strategy tend to look at assets across asset classes, essentially. So if you have bonds and equities falling at the same time, this is usually when you trigger stop losses and unwinding. At this stage, the bond market has been fairly resilient simply because the Fed is still buying 120 billion of bonds and mortgage-backed securities per month. And equities have been relatively sort of stable simply because there is no alternative. Negative bond yield is still the story, and they have been falling. So if you are an investor, you have no other choice but to own credit or equities to make any sort of return. So we'll have to watch the equity bond correlation in the short term for that deleveraging to occur.
Coco, I got to ask you about Evergrande. We're waiting for the official default today, and then I think again on Thursday in terms of a failure to pay. How much does this matter, the shift that we're seeing in China, bond markets testing the state and the state replying, we're not going to help out?
Well, this is an important point, but you have to also remember that there has already been a series of defaults, probably not as big as Evergrande, but the Chinese government policy has been to deleverage its economy. It has a lot of sort of zombies, so to speak, or debts that haven't really been sort of cleaned up in the system. And this is something we remember back in 2015. So I think the bonds already trade at 30 cents on the dollar. So this is not a surprise. And investors have been expecting a lot more regulatory changes with the education tech and some of the other measures. So the common prosperity agenda is more an evolution in the Chinese thinking than a revolution. So I suspect the impact will be limited because the government can always step in to avoid contagion to the Chinese financial system. But there's a clear message that they want to clean up the bad debt that has been plaguing the system for a while.
Koku, thank you so much for joining us. Koku Agbo-Blua there, Global Head of Economics, Cross-Asset and Quant Research at Societe Generale. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg. First word news, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is warning of a catastrophe if Congress does not raise or suspend the U.S. debt ceiling. In the Wall Street Journal, Yellen wrote that the government could run out of money to pay its bills sometime in October. Now, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has rejected appeals to Republicans to join with Democrats in boosting the debt ceiling. After several false starts, bankers are finally getting back to their desks in the City of London. At HSBC's Canary Wharf headquarters, traders, salespeople, and close support staff have been told they're expected to be at their workstations 5 days a week. Meanwhile, occupancy at Goldman Sachs' office is around half and continuing to rise. In Spain, Spain's Canary Islands off northwest Africa, a volcano erupted over the weekend, forcing the evacuation of some 5,000 people. Now, it took place on the island of La Palma. News reports say about 100 houses have been destroyed, but there have been no injuries. The lava flows are moving towards the sea at a speed of close to half a mile an hour, which also, Matt Miller, changed to what the Prime Minister could do. I think he was doing New York, but he's staying behind, and of course a lot of the focus is on the people in La Palma.
Yeah, absolutely. He was due in New York, of course, at that big deal UN meeting. I think he's going to try and make up for that, but he had to go to La Palma right now. You've got lava flows that are just rolling over homes right now. I believe a couple of dozen homes have been destroyed. Fortunately, as far as I've read so far, no one has been injured because there were a series of earthquakes. I think there were dozens and dozens of earthquakes ahead of this, and their early warning system worked, so they were able to evacuate people in time. But the lava flow scenes have been incredible, Francine. It's rolling at, I think, 2,500 feet per minute, so pretty quick.
Yeah, I have to say the pictures are just absolutely incredible. It's different from Pompeii because now we have monitoring in place. I know there were also a couple of volcanoes over in Italy that were active over the summer. I mean, it's just incredible pictures, Danny.
Yeah, it really is. And I have to say, just to put this in the wider global context, we're about to head into COP26, or at least it's already underway. You have climate goals coming out of the U.S. You have to wonder if these sort of pictures really just amplify that need, amplify the progress that they are hoping to make. Again, it's a big week for that, so we'll see whether this comes up in those meetings.
Yeah, coming up, we'll of course talk about UNGA, UN General Assembly Week. Also, it's less than a week until the German elections. We'll speak with the German Green politician Jürgen Trittin. Our Matt Miller talked about cars, and I have to say, Matt Miller, I know you're the resident expert on cars, but this is a huge economic weight, and if you have the Greens coming, it could shape the difference, actually, of the German economy going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was in Munich, I heard a number of car makers, of CEOs, saying they would like to see higher gas prices and a bigger carbon tax. That's definitely something we'll ask Jürgen Trittin about next. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua with Danny Berger in London. Matt Miller in Berlin. Kaylee Lyons is off. Matt, a lot going on in the markets, not on the good side. I have to say it's a pretty critical week for the markets. We have a lot of news, and it's a wall of worries kind of taking over this Monday.
Oh, wall of worry has been
You like
called.
that?
I love it when we get into these wall of worry periods. Of course, if everyone thinks the market's going to go down, it's going to creep slowly up. Not today, of course. We're seeing big drops here, 2% and change. I'll leave it to Danny to walk through what we're seeing. But this, I think, is unrelated to what's going on in the rest of the market. This is just an Evergrande issue, and if the contagion is limited, then you don't really need to worry about it beyond the initial shock waves. But I guess that's a pretty big if today, especially looking at these movements.
Yeah, talking about movements, Danny, what are you seeing in the markets?
Yeah, as you guys have been laying out, it is a volatile down day. Now, it's interesting. I was talking with banker Privé's earlier today, an analyst there who's basically saying that, look, there's certainly risk for things like the euro, things like Europe that has this exposure to China. And that is what we're seeing today. The Europe Stock 600 down 1.8%. Of course, China wasn't open today, so a lot of the angst perhaps spilling out into other markets because of this lack of liquidity. Francine, I think you had the stat. What is it? What is the liabilities of Evergrande again?
$300 billion.
$300 billion. That is the equivalent to 2% in terms of Evergrande's size, 2% of China's GDP. So it's no wonder we have this nervousness. S&P 500 down 1.3% in your pre-market trading. Those SPOOs there falling under the 50-day moving average. That has been a signal to go and buy the dip. We're seeing dip buyers, though, absent from this market. What's gaining is the Bloomberg dollar spot up more than 0.25%. It's that sort of defensive posturing. Of course, it's not just the China story. It's the Fed. It's the macro story. Either way, though, it's a bad day for commodities. Iron ore down for a 9th straight day, below $100 a barrel. Its worst streak since 2015. China wants greener skies for the Olympics. They're curbing steel output, so that's what's hurting there. Here are your pre-market movers. We've been talking about China. You want to play it today. You want to play in today's U.S. market. Go into the ETFs. That's what this one is, a 3 times levered China ETF. No surprise, down more than 7%. Marathon Digital dropping 6%, with Bitcoin dropping below $45,000 as well. Bitcoin not acting as a hedge as perhaps some Bitcoin bulls would hope for. And finally, Tesla down 2%. Wall Street Journal report today saying that the U.S.'s top crash investigator wants Tesla to go and address safety before expanding its cars. Matt, I know you've been paying a lot of attention to Tesla and just cars in general, given what's happening in Germany this week.
Well, yeah, you know, I have to say, on a personal note, on an editorial note, I saw my first Model Y in the flesh here. I actually set off the alarm because my motorcycle was too loud. I actually really love it. I'm not a huge fan of Teslas. Obviously, it's incredibly subjective, but I really love the Model Y. The alarm sensitivity is kind of high. I don't think just starting a BMW R9T next to one should set it off.
It's like an upgrade. I'm sure they'll desensitize it.
Yeah. I'm also imagining Matt Miller out the side doing this, sticking his thumb up on the side of the road when he sees the Model Y, going in to check it out for himself.
It's actually parked next to me in
no
my building.
comment.
But yes, okay, I want to get over to Maria Tadeo. She's obviously here covering the German elections for us. Coming up soon, this Sunday, front runner Olaf Scholz faces a potential stumbling block today when he faces a closed-door grilling from lawmakers about this month's raid at his finance ministry. Will he be grilled? Will they be grilled? Does it make sense that the prosecutor raided the German finance ministry and the justice ministry? I mean, to me, Maria, that is in itself a massive story. Where does the prosecutor get off, or is there a smoking gun in Olaf Scholz's institution?
Yeah, you know, you'd think that would be a big story, but Matt, if you look at the fallout of this, and in particular, if you look at the timing of this a week before the election, what I find incredibly interesting is the fact that it's had no impact on the SPD polling, and it's had no impact on Olaf Scholz, who, by the way, had a third debate yesterday and won that debate. So it's 3 out of 3. So you could argue, you know, to some extent, he's already morphed into Angela Merkel. Scandals don't seem to be affecting his polling in any way. I do have to say, however, the format of that grilling today, it's behind closed doors. It is difficult to make a big media deal out of this when you don't see the candidate. And the other issue, Matt, is that when you look at the actual details, it's very important to stress that no one has accused Olaf Scholz of personally benefiting from any of this or enriching himself. This is about flawed oversight in his ministry. You also have to factor that the CDU is up in arms over this, but this was also under a CDU government. The CDU also was in government, and he was Angela Merkel's finance minister. So again, it is something that you could say would have a big impact, but in real terms, Germans today don't seem to care that much.
Yeah, it's I think, incredibly interesting. Maria, thanks very much. We'll come back to you in a little while. Maria Tadeo covering the election for us. Speaking of, Jürgen Trittin joins us now. Former federal minister for the environment under Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder. In his capacity as minister, he was responsible for the decision to abandon the use of nuclear power by 2020. Currently, Trittin is a Green MP, also serving as deputy member on the committee on the affairs of the European Union. And I think it's fair to say just a massive figure for the Green Party in this country. Thanks so much for joining us, Jürgen. Let me first ask you about this raid. I was just talking to Maria about you have decades of experience in German government. If a U.S. prosecutor raided the Department of Justice, especially a week before an election, there would be an uproar. Why does no one seem to care that a prosecutor in this country raided, physically sent people to go into the finance ministry and justice ministries of the federal government and take stuff?
I think I'm astonished too, but the reality is this is not something really new to Olaf Scholz, because at the time as mayor of Hamburg, he donated more than 47 million tax debts to a private bank that gained money from the fraud from the Cum-Ex business, and he was blamed not to overview the problems with the Wirecard scandal, and for a long time there are allegations that the Financial Intelligence Unit is not working hard enough on money laundering, and there has been contacts between the finance minister and the Financial Intelligence Unit, and that was the background for the raid. So it's a normal case. If you see something as Attorney General in Lower Saxony, you have to act.
All right, so you think there's smoke there. This isn't just someone with a political axe to grind jumping in a week before a federal election to... No. All right, let me move on let me move on to the possibility of coalitions here, because this is where, it's going to get interesting. Regardless of who wins, the Greens have gained so much power in the last months and years. Would you not consider a black-green coalition? Would you not consider working together with the Conservatives in government? Because, before the SPD started to come on so strong, that was what all the talk was about.
Well, this is a campaign that will last for, again, 7 days. We had some interesting moments in this campaign, and we don't know what the result will be. If I look on the figures you show on the screen, the simple answer is if that comes true, there will be only 3-party coalitions possible. And in this case, we will have intensive and, from my view, open-ended negotiations. And I'm convinced that we will not have a new German government before December.
So, Mr. Trittin, can you give us an idea? First of all, do you think the Greens will definitely be on the cusp of government? And do you have any red lines?
Well, if I understand Armin Laschet and Olaf Scholz correctly, they are not hostile to the idea of going on together in a form of grand coalition. And for sure, this is a possibility, and this is the only 2-party possibility, and it depends on the result of the Green Party, whether it is impossible to organize again a black and red majority. That is what we are fighting for. The second thing is, yes, we are willing to negotiate with everyone, and there will be one key issue from our side. That's the climate crisis.
But specifically what? So is it quotas on pollution? Is it, how can you basically put things in place that are good for the environment whilst at the same time making sure that business is on side?
We are talking about a whole transition of the whole industry in Germany. It is not on the environment. it is also how do we organize steel mills? Will they use hydrogen in future or going on with carbon? Is the question, how do we organize the heating of the buildings? Do we still depend on fossil imported energies, or do we go away by heating pumps and solar panels? And this is the whole thing, and there will be huge opportunities for new jobs. Look at the time we created the renewable energy law. In the best times, there has been 400,000 new jobs. The policy of 16 years of Merkel, 12 years under participation of the Social Democrats, had put a brake on the development of renewables in Germany. This brake must be put away. And this is one of the key conditions for any form of government participation for the Greens.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised, Jürgen, down in Munich last week, talking to the CEOs of the biggest German car makers, of all the German car makers, actually. And many of them said, Herbert D. specifically, we need politicians to raise the price of diesel. We need a much bigger carbon tax. And this isn't something you typically hear from automaker CEOs. Do you agree that these two moves need to be done in order to make Germany a little bit greener?
There are strange new coalitions. The Greens have new allies. The car drivers' lobby, ADAC, is now in favor for limiting the speed on Germany's Autobahn. The CEO of Volkswagen is going on the same position as we did since a decade. Stop the subsidizing of diesel. Otherwise, clean technologies, and that means battery-driven electrical vehicles, we don't have a chance for that. They are open to new technical standards. We want to phase out all combustion engines on the vehicle level up to 2030. BMW, Volkswagen, Daimler are in favor to do it earlier than 2030. So what we see is that industry is far ahead of our competing parties, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats as well.
Thank you so much for your time today, Jürgen Trittin from the Greens in Germany. And of course, the election just 6 days away. Coming up, the dream of owning a home is increasingly out of reach. We'll discuss how soaring housing prices are affecting governments across the globe. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller in Berlin with Francine Lacqua and Danny Berger in London. All very expensive places to live. Actually, even Berlin is becoming a very expensive place to live. It's a phenomenon given wings by the pandemic, soaring housing prices, forcing people across the globe to give up dreams of home ownership and forcing governments to deal with the consequences or be thrown out of office. Bloomberg International government reporter Alan Crawford joins us now with his big take story, which is fantastic. It's something I've been thinking about for months and months now, but you've noticed, because I'm looking for a house, but you've noticed it in the halls of power, evicting some people and toppling governments.
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing it particularly here in Berlin. We're seeing demonstrations against, these are rent price increases, but also actual home prices are going through the roof. We've seen something like 45 straight quarters of price increases here, which is unprecedented across Germany.
45 straight quarters of price increases.
In the US, it's even more dramatic, and it's happening not just in the traditional hotspots of San Francisco, New York. It's right across. I saw something like 28% price increases of buying a single-family home in Boise, Idaho, in the first quarter of this year compared to the year before. It's across the board.
Wow. Alan, I mean, it's pretty crazy, and this is a case in London, Paris, Rome, and you're also mentioning Idaho. Does it, you know, if you look at supply and demand, does it actually change, or do prices keep on rising?
Well, what we've seen is, as a result of the pandemic, then prices are reaching fresh records. It's because of ultra-low interest rates, just the sheer fact that not many homes are being built. But we're seeing it also right across the world. And that it's not just about the simple numbers, it's also a generational issue, because statistically, baby boomers are far more likely to own their own homes, and so millennials and Gen Z are the ones that are being left behind.
Yeah. Alan, I think Matt wants me to go in and defend Idaho, but instead of that, I'm going to ask a political question. Yeah, go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
I don't think that people from outside of the U.S. maybe understand how cool Idaho is. I mean, it's a pretty awesome place to live. You think of just the potatoes, but there's also a pretty amazing ski culture there, and it's kind of like the Wild West in a way. So Boise isn't, you know, a lame place to live.
Bridgeport, Connecticut was another place with almost 30%.
Okay, I wouldn't want to live there. Yeah. Fair enough.
Well, I guess it's been shown how cool it is because housing prices are going up. Alan, quickly here, what has kind of been the common thread among politicians' responses to these higher prices?
There's no real single thread that politicians are scrambling about to look for any kind of solutions, so that we're seeing examples of attempts to introduce caps on rent. We're seeing big moves in the Canadian election to ban foreign buyers from coming in to buy up apartments and stoke the prices. Even in Ireland, there's an attempt by the main opposition party to force banks to limit the amount of interest that they charge on mortgages, so that the politicians they're scrambling for solutions, but there isn't really any sustainable fix, and the result of all of that is really political uncertainty.
So what does it mean for, you know, the existing housing debt, Alan?
Well, actually, Bloomberg Economics has done a lot of work on this, and they're pointing out the obvious, if you like, that if there's any increase in interest rates, then a whole cohorts of society are going to be at risk here. So that, of course, brings all sorts of other, political uncertainties, not least economic and financial uncertainties.
Alan, thanks so much. Alan Crawford there with today's big take on house prices and rent. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Danny Berger with Francine Lacqua. Aside me in London, Matt Miller is in Berlin. Now, Bill Gates has raised more than $1 billion in corporate funding for his breakthrough energy catalyst program. Gates is drawing on BlackRock's Larry Fink and other CEOs to rally support for some of the world's most demanding clean energy projects. Bill Gates discussed the initiative exclusively with Bloomberg's Eric Schatzker.
If government was doing it by itself, you wouldn't have the breadth of expertise you need. So our expertise, the company's expertise with the governments, are taking a lot of recovery money. Europe, has committed a lot of capital. The Congress is debating substantial money in the two different bills there that, if those go through, will allow this effort to go full speed.
Bill Gates there is speaking exclusively with Bloomberg's Eric Schatzker. Now, Tom Keene, co-anchor of Bloomberg Surveillance, joins us now. Tom wants to talk about the markets. Tom, I want to talk about tennis.
Here we go.
You were number 3, the third dinner guest.
I was not number 1. I was
that
number 3.
The young star that won the U.S. Open chose you. I mean, I knew this all along, and I don't know whether you even play tennis.
Well, I played years ago, actually, and I had an immense influence on young Emma's game. There's no question about that. The hockey coach, the tennis coach said, Francine, don't give up the day job, is what they said.
Okay. Well, Tom, you're always top of my list for dinner. What's on your chart today?
What's on my chart today is to get beyond tennis and get to the markets. And this is getting serious. There's some correlations here, Francine, that really add up. I want to show a foundational correlation. This is just one piece. I'm not linking in the short-term trust market, the liquidity market, into what we're seeing in Hong Kong and in China. But the fact is the overnight repo market broke out to new highs in the last couple of days, well out over 1.2 trillion. Maybe it's a tough correlation there, Francine, but I'll take it as a tea leaf along the way.
I will take it as a tea leaf. Tom Keene, our superstar icon, co-anchor of Bloomberg Surveillance. Now, there's quite a lot going on today, and Danny, you're basically watching markets.
Yeah, it's a dramatic day, a lot of that having to do with contagion fears, but specifically S&P 500 futures breaking below their 50-day moving average. Typically, you see dip buyers step in at this point, just in terms of the technical level. Will we see the cash market open below that resistance band? And Matt, will people buy it?
Yeah, definitely got to watch. We just saw the stock 600, for example, fall to losses of more than 2%. I'm watching these French defense talks and what Macron is going to do. Is he going to injure NATO because of Biden's move to go behind the French back and make a deal with Australia? This is Bloomberg.